The year is 1812. Across the frozen plains of Russia, 500,000 men march toward their doom. At their head rides a small figure in a gray coat, his hand tucked into his vest, his eyes fixed on Moscow's distant spires. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, and he has conquered nearly all of Europe. Kings bow before him. Empires tremble at his name. Yet in just 3 years, he will die alone on a desolate island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, abandoned by the world he once ruled. How does a man rise from nothing to become emperor of the greatest power on earth, only to lose it all? This is the story of ambition, genius, and the brutal price of glory. The story begins not in palaces or castles, but on a rough Mediterranean island called Corsica. It's August 15th, 1769. The island has just been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa, and the Corsican people are still fighting their new masters in the mountains. Into this world of rebellion and poverty comes Napoleon Bonaparte, second son of a minor noble family that has seen better days. His father, Carlo, is a lawyer who switches sides, abandoning the Corsican resistance to serve the French occupiers. His mother, Letizia, is a woman of iron will who will outlive nearly all her children. Young Napoleon grows up speaking Corsican and Italian before he ever learns proper French. He is small, thin, olive-skinned, with intense dark eyes that seem to burn with some inner fire. The other children mock his accent, his foreign ways, his shabby clothes. He retreats into books, into mathematics, into dreams of ancient Rome and Alexander the Great. At 9 years old, Napoleon is sent to a military school in France. The French boys torment him mercilessly. They call him the Corsican, the outsider, the Italian. He fights back with his fists and his pride, but the humiliation cuts deep. In the cold dormitories of Brienne, he discovers his genius for mathematics and military strategy. While other boys play, he reads obsessively about ancient battles, about Caesar and Hannibal. He covers his notebooks with artillery calculations and tactical diagrams. His teachers notice something unusual about this strange, angry boy. He doesn't just memorize. He understands. He sees patterns where others see chaos. At 16, he enters the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, completing a 2-year program in just 1 year. He becomes an artillery officer, the lowest rung of military nobility, dependent on a small salary and burning with resentment at a world that looks down on him. Then comes 1789, and the world catches fire. The French Revolution explodes across the nation. The old order, with its kings and nobles and ancient privileges, begins to collapse. Nobles flee the country or face the guillotine. The radical revolutionaries execute King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Europe's other monarchies, horrified and terrified, declare war on revolutionary France. In this chaos, opportunity blooms for men like Napoleon. He is 20 years old, passionate about revolution, convinced that talent and merit should triumph over birth and privilege. He writes political pamphlets. He argues with his fellow Corsicans who want independence from France. When civil war breaks out in Corsica, his family is forced to flee to mainland France. They arrive as refugees, nearly penniless. Napoleon is now truly French by necessity, with no homeland to return to. His moment comes in 1793 at a place called Toulon. The port city has been seized by royalist rebels and British forces. The revolutionary government desperately needs to recapture it. Napoleon, still a junior officer, proposes a bold artillery strategy. Ignore the harbor, he says. Seize the heights above the city and rain cannon, fire down on the British ships. The plan works brilliantly. The British evacuate. Toulon falls. Overnight, Napoleon becomes a hero of the revolution. He is promoted to brigadier general at age 24. But the revolution is a hungry beast that devours its own children. Political factions struggle for power. The terror consumes thousands in a frenzy of executions. Napoleon himself is briefly imprisoned when his political patrons fall from power. He comes within hours of facing the guillotine before being released due to lack of evidence. In October 1795, Paris erupts in royalist uprising. A mob of thousands advances on the Tuileries Palace where the revolutionary government meets. The politicians are desperate, panicking. They turn to Napoleon, giving him command of the troops defending the government. What happens next will define Napoleon's approach to power. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't retreat. He orders his artillery to fire grapeshot directly into the crowd. The cannon roar. The mob is shattered in minutes, leaving the streets littered with hundreds of dead and dying. It is brutal, decisive, and effective. Napoleon has saved the government and proven he will do whatever is necessary to maintain order. He is promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior. He is now one of the most powerful men in France, and he is only 26 years old. 6 months later, he marries Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior, a woman of grace and beauty who moves in the highest circles of Paris society. Napoleon is madly, desperately in love with her. She is charmed by his intensity, but doesn't return his passion with equal fervor. It doesn't matter. Napoleon uses her connections and his own growing reputation to secure command of the Army of Italy. France is still at war with most of Europe, and the Italian front has been a disaster, underfunded, and forgotten. Napoleon arrives to find an army of starving, barefoot men who haven't been paid in months. He gives them a speech that becomes legendary. "Soldiers," he tells them, "you are naked and hungry. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." He keeps his promise. In a series of brilliant campaigns, Napoleon defeats the Austrian armies in Italy, one after another. He moves faster than anyone thought possible, striking where the enemy least expects, using artillery with deadly precision. His soldiers worship him because he wins battles and fills their pockets with plunder. He becomes a legend across Europe. People speak of him with awe and terror. The young general who rewrites the rules of warfare. The man who cannot be defeated. He returns to France as a conquering hero, the most famous man in the nation. The weak, corrupt Directory government that rules France now fears him, but they can't move against him. He is too popular, too powerful. In 1798, Napoleon proposes an audacious plan: invade Egypt, cut Britain's route to India, discover the ancient secrets of the pharaohs. It is part military campaign, part imperial adventure, part scientific expedition. He sails with an army of 40,000 men and a team of scholars and scientists. He wins the Battle of the Pyramids, standing in the shadow of monuments 4,000 years old. "Soldiers," he proclaims, "from the summit of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." But the campaign becomes a disaster. The British destroy his fleet at the Battle of the Nile, trapping him in Egypt. Plague ravages his army. A campaign in Syria fails bloodily. Napoleon abandons his army and secretly sails back to France, leaving his men to their fate. It is an act of cold calculation. His personal glory matters more than their lives. He arrives in Paris in October 1799 to find France on the brink of collapse. The Directory is bankrupt and despised. Foreign armies threaten the borders. The people are exhausted by a decade of revolution and war. Napoleon seizes the moment. In a carefully planned coup d'etat, he overthrows the government. There is some resistance. A mob of politicians tries to stop him. His brother Lucien, as president of the Assembly, saves him with quick thinking and bold lies. Soldiers clear the chamber with bayonets. It is done. Napoleon becomes first consul, effectively dictator of France, though he carefully maintains the appearance of republican government. He is 30 years old and master of France. What follows is a transformation of French society that will echo for centuries. Napoleon doesn't just rule, he rebuilds. He creates the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive system of civil law that still forms the basis of legal systems in dozens of countries. It abolishes feudalism and establishes equality before the law. It protects property rights and individual contracts. Women lose many rights they had briefly gained during the Revolution, but overall, it is the most progressive legal code in Europe. Napoleon reforms education, creating the lycée system of public secondary schools. He establishes the Bank of France to stabilize the currency. He makes peace with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, healing the bitter divide between revolutionary France and the papacy. He creates the Legion of Honor, rewarding merit rather than birth. He promotes based on talent, raising commoners to positions of power unthinkable under the old monarchy. But peace is temporary. War resumes with Britain and Austria. Napoleon wins crushing victories at Marengo in Italy and at Austerlitz against the combined Russian and Austrian armies. Austerlitz is his masterpiece. He deliberately weakens his right flank, luring the Allies into a trap, then strikes their center with devastating force, cutting their army in two. Tsar Alexander of Russia weeps at the sight of his shattered army. Holy Roman Emperor Francis accepts humiliating terms. After Austerlitz, Napoleon doesn't just defeat kings. He remakes the map of Europe. He creates kingdoms for his brothers and sisters. He abolishes the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire. He forces Prussia to its knees after crushing their army at Jena. The old world is dying. A new European order is being born with Napoleon as its architect and emperor. Yes, emperor. In 1804, Napoleon has himself crowned Emperor of the French in an elaborate ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. Pope Pius VII travels to Paris to consecrate him, but at the crucial moment, Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope's hands and places it on his own head. The message is clear. He doesn't receive power from God or church. He takes it by his own will and strength. He creates an imperial court, surrounding himself with the pageantry of monarchy, even as he claims to represent revolutionary ideals. His siblings become kings and queens. His marshals become dukes and princes. Yet Napoleon never forgets his origins. He promotes soldiers from the ranks, rewards merit, and maintains the legal equality that distinguishes his empire from the old aristocratic order. But with every victory, the web of enemies grows. Britain remains unconquered beyond the Channel, funding coalition after coalition against him. Napoleon plans an invasion, massing 200,000 troops on the French coast, but his fleet cannot challenge British naval supremacy. After Admiral Nelson destroys the combined Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, the invasion is abandoned. Napoleon turns east instead, defeating the Russians and Prussians again at Friedland. He meets Tsar Alexander on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River and divides Europe between them in the Treaty of Tilsit. Napoleon is at the height of his power, master of virtually all of continental Europe from Spain to Poland. Yet something is changing in Napoleon himself. The young general who lived on hardtack and slept in his soldiers camps has become an emperor who demands elaborate protocol. He divorces Josephine, the love of his life, because she cannot give him an heir. He marries Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, becoming son-in-law to the very monarchy he once fought. When she gives him a son, Napoleon is ecstatic. He has his dynasty. But he has sacrificed love for political calculation, and perhaps something dies in him with this choice. His decisions become more erratic, more grandiose, less grounded in reality. In 1812, Napoleon makes the fatal mistake that will destroy him. Tsar Alexander has broken the continental system, Napoleon's attempt to economically isolate Britain. Napoleon cannot tolerate this defiance. He assembles the largest army ever seen in Europe, 600,000 men from across his empire. French, German, Italian, Polish, Dutch. They march into Russia in June. Napoleon expects a quick campaign, a decisive battle, victory within weeks. But the Russians refuse to fight. They retreat, burning their own towns and fields as they go. The French army advances deeper and deeper into the endless Russian landscape, finding nothing but ash and empty villages. Supply lines stretch impossibly thin. Men and horses begin to die from hunger and exhaustion, even before a major battle is fought. Finally, in September, the Russians make a stand at Borodino, 70 miles from Moscow. It is the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. 70,000 men are killed or wounded in 12 hours of savage fighting. Napoleon wins the field, but at a terrible cost. He occupies Moscow, expecting the Tsar to sue for peace. Instead, the Russians burn their own capital. Napoleon waits in the smoking ruins for 5 weeks, hoping for surrender that never comes. Finally, in October, with winter approaching, he orders the retreat. It becomes a nightmare. The Russian winter arrives early. The temperature drops to 30 below zero. The French army, already weakened by months of hunger and disease, begins to disintegrate. Russian cavalry and partisans harry the retreat constantly. Men freeze to death in their sleep. Horses die by the thousands, so there's no transport for supplies or the wounded. Discipline collapses. Of the 600,000 who marched into Russia, barely 40,000 return in fighting condition. It is one of the greatest military disasters in history. Europe senses weakness. Prussia and Austria, former allies, join Russia and Britain in a new coalition. Napoleon raises another army with desperate speed, but the magic is gone. At Leipzig, in October 1813, in the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the Allied armies defeat him decisively. The Grand Empire begins to crumble. German states defect. Italy rises in revolt. His brother Joseph is driven from the throne of Spain. By early 1814, foreign armies are on French soil for the first time in 20 years. Napoleon fights brilliantly in a series of defensive battles, but he is outnumbered and exhausted. His marshals lose faith. Politicians in Paris intrigue against him. In April 1814, with enemy armies closing on Paris, Napoleon's own generals force him to abdicate. He attempts suicide with poison he has carried since a near capture in Russia, but the poison has lost its potency. He survives, broken and humiliated. The victorious Allies exile him to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast. They give him the title of Emperor of Elba, a bitter joke. He is allowed a guard of a few hundred men and a tiny court. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Bourbon monarchy is restored. King Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, returns from exile. But the Bourbons have learned nothing. They try to turn back the clock, to restore the privileges of the old aristocracy. France grows restless. And on Elba, Napoleon watches and waits. He receives secret reports of discontent in France, of his soldiers' loyalty to him, rather than the restored king. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escapes Elba with 1,000 men. He lands in southern France and begins marching toward Paris. The government sends army units to stop him. Instead, they join him. When a regiment confronts him, Napoleon walks forward alone, opens his coat, and shouts, "Soldiers of the Fifth, if any man wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers break ranks and cheer. Marshal Ney, who had promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, instead embraces him and joins his cause. King Louis XVIII flees. Without firing a shot, Napoleon retakes Paris. Europe is stunned. The 100 Days begin. But the Allies will not negotiate. They declare Napoleon an outlaw and mass their armies. Napoleon knows he must strike quickly before the full coalition can gather. He invades Belgium, hoping to defeat the British and Prussian armies separately before the Austrians and Russians arrive. On June 18, 1815, on muddy fields near a small Belgian village called Waterloo, Napoleon fights his last battle. It is a near thing. The British under Wellington hold desperately. Napoleon waits too long to commit his Imperial Guard, his elite troops. The Prussians arrive to reinforce Wellington. As evening falls, Napoleon sends the Guard forward in a final assault. For the first time in their history, the Guard breaks and retreats. The cry goes up, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. The French army collapses into rout. Napoleon flees the field. His fate is sealed. This time there will be no comfortable exile. The British take no chances. They ship Napoleon to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. He arrives in October 1815. He will never leave. He lives in a damp house called Longwood, attended by a handful of loyal followers, guarded by British soldiers, slowly dying of stomach cancer or perhaps arsenic poisoning from the copper arsenic compound in the wallpaper of his rooms. He spends his days dictating memoirs, rewriting history, creating the Napoleonic legend. He dies on May 5, 1821, at 51 years old, murmuring words about the army and his son. In death, Napoleon achieves something he never could in life. He becomes a symbol, an idea more powerful than any empire. His body is eventually returned to Paris and entombed with honoring less invalids. His legal code spreads across the globe. His military tactics are studied in every war academy. He abolished serfdom across his empire. He spread the ideals of the French Revolution, however imperfectly. He showed that a man from nowhere could rise to rule the world. Yet he also showed the terrible cost of unchecked ambition. Millions died in his wars. Nations were devastated. Families destroyed. For what? For glory. For power. For one man's vision of greatness. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is ultimately a mirror that reflects our own deepest questions about ambition, power, and human nature itself, and forces us to ask whether the line between the visionary leader who changes history and the tyrant who destroys it is thinner than we like to believe, and whether the modern world we inhabit, with all its promise and peril, is still echoing with the footsteps of that small man in the gray coat who once held the fate of nations in his hand.